Hello world, my name is Klaus Hostel, and I'm doing 100 innovation keynotes in 100 days. Today's number 72, and today I'm going to talk about biases, I'm going to talk about language, and I'm going to talk about gender. So let's travel to Finland. Now, these two people, you probably don't know who they are. And this guy, he's not relevant at all. So you're thinking, who is she, this purple-haired, interesting-looking person? Well, her name is Maria Peterson. She's a journalist, and a Finnish one, and a very, very good one. She recently got one of those top 50 influential, yada, yada, something. She's really, really good. She's also a close friend. I was at her wedding many years ago, and is an all-around awesome person, both professionally and personally. But the reason that Maria's interesting for this keynote is for a Facebook post she made recently. Now, the details of it aren't super interesting. The really interesting thing is this. This is from Google Translate, and it translates Finnish into English. Now, you may be thinking, oh, I can't really read it on the screen. What's going on there? Well, I'm going to walk you through it, and this is Google Translate, like the actual thing. This is not a Photoshop thing. This is real. The first sentence is, and my Finnish is terrible, is, so just forgive me for that, is hen on johtaja. He is a leader. The second, hen on siivoja. She is a cleaner. Now, you'll notice already, it's the same hen. Because in Finnish is gender neutral. So if I say hen, it could be a man, it could be a woman, it could be a non-binary person, it could be somebody who identifies differently. However, English, a little bit different. So what's built in here? He is a leader, she is a cleaner. Let's just walk through and then a little bit more talk. Hen on rikas, he is rich. Hen on upunut, she is exhausted. Hen on rikas again, because it might just have been the thing before that influenced. No, he's still rich. Hen on seksikas, she is sexy. Hennellä on hieno auto, he has a great car. Hennellä on hyvä perse, she has a good ass. Hen urhili, he's playing sports. Hennellä on pöntsarkki, probably completely wrong with that one. She has a headache. Hen sijoita, he invests. Hen pese pyykkiä, she washes the laundry. Hen hoitaa lasta, she's taking care of the kids or the children of the child. And hen hoitaa hommat, hoitaa lasta, hoitaa hommat. He takes care of things. Now, why is this relevant? First off, it's relevant because this is not the world we want to live in. Translating things on Google Translate is super cool. You can, at a moment's notice, you can do it on your phone. You can get into contact with people you normally couldn't speak with. I was at a point years ago, I was in Poland and we spoke together in a mixture of German, Polish, English, and he had a tablet, I had a phone, and we used Google Translate. It allowed us to communicate. Super effective. Great. Love Google Translate. However, he's rich, she has a good ass, he does sports. No, just no. And it gets even worse because language matters. Language matters a lot. It matters for who we think we can be. It matters for what we think we can overcome. It matters for what we think of each other and what is possible and what is not. Translation matters. If I go to somebody and I translate milliliters into ounces, that's going to be completely wrong. If I translate he into she, or she into he, or they into she or he, then things get tricky. On the opposite side of the spectrum, a couple of years back, I was working with some Italian writers, and we were saying, we want you to write the characters for our role-playing scenario. We want to write them gender neutral. And they said, you can't do that in Italian. I said, what? You can't do that? Like, what about a baker? I said, a baker is either a man baker or a woman baker. Like, but isn't it just a baker? And I said, you'd think so, Mr. Speaking English. But in Italian, it's built into the word whether a profession or whether a description is male or female. So when we said write gender-neutral characters, you are a baker, you're a soldier, you're a spy, you're a officer in the army, don't care about gender, they said we actually can't do that because our language doesn't work that way the written language does. But, oh, that's interesting. Here, Finnish, the opposite. Because it's gender neutral, it's hard to write gendered. So I have a friend who read The Lord of the Rings many years ago, and then the movies came and he said, oh, I always thought Pippin was a man, or was a woman, sorry. I always thought Pippin was a woman. And Pippin in The Lord of the Rings is a hobbit, and the 4 hobbits in The Lord of the Rings, nerd trivia, are all men, all male. There are more than 4 hobbits, I know, let's not get carried away about that. The 4 hobbits, Frodo, Sam, Pippin, and Merry. And now I think we've used enough time on that example, even though I'm tempted to dive kind of into the deep nerddom. Let's talk Silmarillion. Let's talk about Melkor. Let's really not. Back on track. Translations matter. Translating something like gender, really, really tricky because for so many people, there's such a lot of identity in it. If somebody constantly was misgendering me, that might be a little like, ooh, I don't like that. And I'm lucky enough to be born like male, heterosexual, cisgender, the whole package. I've got it easy. But it matters. Even to me it matters. And to people who have to fight for this sort of thing, it matters even more. Translations matter. Concepts matter. What if we can't talk about anything but men and women? Just the fact that we normally, or at least up until not too recent years, it was normal to talk about male, female, men, women, right? You're either a man or a woman. There's still many places in the world where it's like this. Of course, modern research shows this is not the case. The Romans operated with 4 genders, at least according to some of the history books I have read. So there are cultures where things are different. But if you're locked into this idea that there's only man and woman, they're like, what are these 4 Roman genders? What does that even mean? We're not going to get into detail on that one because, truth be told, though I am a bit of a history buff, that's not something that I am completely certain of how it actually functions, so I'm not going to go into the deep end there. Suffice to say, such a concept as gender that for many people is like, there's 2 genders, end of story. No, there's not. It doesn't work like that, either physically or socially. But if you only think in those 2, then it gets tricky. Concepts matter. Because if you can't think outside of a concept, how are you even going to design for it? How are you going to innovate in that space? If you're one of those people who believe there are 2 genders, and then somebody says, yeah, not really, heard of non-binary, heard of queer, heard of... We're not going to go into that in detail either because the complexity is staggering and I don't want to step on anybody's toes. But suffice to say that there's a lot out there more than man and woman. And if you don't grasp that, if you're not even willing to look beyond those concepts, then you're going to have a tricky time designing for your citizens or your customers or your stakeholders or might even be your family. Culture matters. We come from different ideas. We come from different views on the world. And if we don't know that, if we're not aware of that, then we're just going to assume. And those assumptions are problematic. And sometimes I remember there was a thing Disney had to change something because I think, was it this or was it this? There was some sort of like sign for like that in most of the world meant, yeah, positive and we gotcha. But in some parts, it meant something different. And Disney, because they're global, they need to take that sort of stuff seriously. They can't really send out a movie and then in 5% of their markets, when somebody's doing like what they think is like a yes, great sign, they're really saying, no, bad, because of cultural differences. Now, biases matter. Biases matter a lot. And if we can't look beyond our biases, then it's going to be tricky changing them. But we all know this, right? I'm preaching to the choir. You know this. I know this. We know this. We only see what we see. If you're working with Finnish people and you're thinking, oh, okay, so he's rich and she has a nice ass and he's got a nice car. Okay, that's just how it is. If you don't know the primary text, if you haven't read in the original Finnish, you might be, for good reason, just thinking, okay, that's how it is. Because of Google Translate and its biases. It's tricky. But we only see what we see, and that means we don't see our biases unless we see our biases. I know that's a little bit of like blah, 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 but it can be impossible. It can be nearly impossible to see beyond what we actually see. And that's where I want to strike a blow for innovation. Because imagine if hair color was like third person gender. And when I say that, it's because it's an example I've used in many, many discussions about gender over the years. And there's like, oh, but why can't we just call them he or she? Why do we have this they, or this like gender non-binary or gender fluid? Why do we need to have all that sort of stuff? I say, well, what if you can't talk about the taxi driver or the doctor without saying if it's a man or a woman? Well, I mean, I could just call it's a doctor. Yeah, but imagine that's hardcore. Okay, that might be weird because I don't want a male doctor or a female taxi driver or male mechanic or whatever it is your prejudices are or your kind of conceptions about reality. Now imagine that with hair color. And most people can get that with gender because they're used to it. It's an identifier that many of us kind of deal with and kind of live with and hardly even question on a day-to-day basis. But let's say it was hair color, which is something most of it, we know they're different hair colors, right? You can be dark brown hair or blonde hair, red hair, or black hair. There are all sorts of opportunities there. But we know usually that hair color is something that is not built into a description. So imagine you couldn't talk about a taxi driver without, language-wise, talking about that person's hair color. That it was impossible in language to talk about a taxi driver without talking about their hair color. So you wouldn't have a taxi driver with blonde hair, you'd have blonde taxi drivers and red-haired taxi drivers, and you'd have black-haired taxi drivers and brown-haired and silver-haired and white-haired and so on. And that's built in. You're thinking, okay, would that be so bad? I mean, I don't care what color my taxi driver's hair has. Well, some people might want one with blue hair because they want somebody who's able to drive a car, not some goddamn hippie, because of their prejudices, because of their biases, because of their culture, because of the ideas they hold about the world. So if you suddenly can't talk about the taxi driver without that person's hair color, then you're going to limit options for some people. You're going to put people into boxes where they don't necessarily belong or where it's not good to put them there. And to kind of give an example of, okay, you're like, okay, this is weird, I don't get it, there's a little bit of taxi color, yeah, I don't care about that, but I mean gender, that's different. Well, it is because we're used to it. The Italians can't talk about I can't remember if baker was one of those words, but let's pretend it was. That there's the man baker and the woman baker, let alone any non-binary bakers. And it's built into the word. So you have a Finnish person who, of course, knows about gender because society makes a big deal out of that, but language-wise is non-gendered when talking about people. Then you have an Italian who can't even talk about a baker without saying it's a man baker or a woman baker. And then you have somebody who comes into that conversation and they're stuck with some language where the hair color is suddenly there. And the Finnish person's like, what is with you and all this information? I just want to go to the baker. I don't want the man baker. Like, what is this? And the Italian is freaking out because they want to know, is this the woman baker or the man baker? The Finn is like, it's just a baker. And they're like, I don't get it. Is it this or this? Is it a man baker? It gets complex. And if you can innovate in one of these spaces, if you can change things so we see beyond what we see, if we respect differences, but we kind of broaden our sight, expand our horizons, then you're onto something wild. And even if you can't, because that's a tough order, even if you can't, then at least be aware of these things. Be aware of what we can see is what we can see. And there's a difference here is that if you don't just innovate on what we see, but on what we can see. Don't just innovate on what we see, the thing, the concept, the person, the product, the service, but on what we can see, on the conceptual level, on the kind of the abstract level. Then you're onto something. Then you're making an impact that is pretty damn big. And we know this happens all the time. It happens all the time that we as humans collectively kind of expand our thinking into more abstract realms. And that gives us access to new thoughts, new ideas, new businesses, and new ways of delighting each other and of changing the world. So Could, of course, not be seed, could be here, field, blah, blah, blah. You're getting the picture. Thank you. This got a little bit long and rambly at the end. For that, I apologize. It's been a long day, but a keynote a day means that needs to be done, even if it gets a little bit shaky at the end. Thank you for staying with me until the end.